Let me show you how a PHP framework handles a HTTP request. First, the request is received by the server. This is forwarded to a file called a front controller. That sounds technical, but it's actually usually just a index.php file located in a public folder called web or public. Inside of here, a request object is instantiated. This object encapsulates a snapshot of the PHP superglobals in their current state when the request is received. Next, an object called the kernel is instantiated. You can think of this kernel object as the heart of the framework, and you can condense what the kernel does into one sentence. It takes a request and turns it into a response. But let's dive a little deeper. One of the first things that the kernel can do is to dispatch a request event. Dedicated listener objects will be listening out for this event, and they will be able to modify the request on the fly. Request needs a handler, i.e. a callable function that will take the information contained in the request and do whatever is required in order to produce the correct response. The handler will typically be a method on a controller class, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, any callable will work. But before we get that far, the correct handler for the request needs to be located. Enter the router component. The router will read the request URI, and using regular expressions, the URI is matched to a pre-configured route. This is a route which URI could define in our application, and each route has its own dedicated handler. Example, here is a posts/23 URI which matches this regex. This is handled by a show method on the post controller, and the number 23 is matched to this ID part of the regex and passed in as the ID argument to the show method. If, however, a route is not found for the URI, then an exception is thrown and caught by the kernel object and used to create a 404 error response. If the handler is found, then it will do what it needs to do and return a successful response to the kernel. Just before the response is returned to the front controller, i.e. our index.php file, there is a chance to dispatch a response event, and this is an opportunity for any registered listeners to modify the response just before it is returned. Finally, the response is returned to the front controller, and a send method is called on the response, which sends the content back to the client which made the request, and this can be a string containing HTML, JSON, or simply plain text. In PHP Framework Pro, we're going to build all the components in order to recreate the scenario I just described from scratch, as well as all the other parts which go into modern PHP frameworks, such as Dependency Injection Container, database models and migrations, viewed templates, components for authentication, and all the rest. Here are some of the job descriptions I went through the last time I was in the market for a new role. As you'll see, every single one lists major framework experience as essential. This course is going to take things one step further by showing you exactly how those frameworks function, and we're going to examine all of the techniques that they use. This will not only put you streets ahead of the competition in the jobs market, but it will give you a level of understanding which the majority of developers simply do not have. I'll see you on the inside. For our framework, we're going to employ a software design pattern called the front controller. Now, don't be intimidated by the technical sounding name, because in reality a front controller in PHP is simply a solitary script which handles all of the web requests for that application. Every single request which your application receives is first directed to this script, and all PHP frameworks implement this pattern for the following reasons. Centralized control. Because the front controller handles all requests, it's very easy to enforce application-wide policies such as user tracking and security. System maintainability. A single entry point system like the front controller means that duplicate code is easily avoided. Configurability. As only one front controller is employed in a web application, the application config is greatly simplified. So here I have a brand new empty project. I say it's empty, I do have one file in there actually, and that is just a git ignore file. I am using git, but it's entirely up to you if you want to use git. The git ignore file just contains one entry, and that is this one here, and it's just to prevent any things which the IDE that I'm using, PHP Storm, from entering the repository. Okay, so let's make a start here. You're going to be really disappointed when I show you this, because a front controller, like I say, despite the really technical sounding name, actually all it comprises of is just a single index.php script. So let's go and create that now. First, I'm going to create a public folder. So the public folder, this is going to be the only publicly accessible files which can be accessed from a client on the web. All my other files are going to live outside of this folder. So public, and then inside of here we're just going to create a PHP file called index.php. And then here I'm just going to sketch out some of the steps that this script will take. So our application will receive a HTTP request, and then what we'll do is perform some logic, and then we're going to send back a HTTP response. And what that is in reality, it will just be a string of content. That's basically how this works. If you send back HTML from PHP application, you're just sending back a string of content. And the same if it's like a JSON request, you're just sending back a string of JSON content. Start off with here, we're going to keep life really simple, and we're just going to echo hello world. And I'm going to show you two different ways that we can spin up a web server. So we can use PHP's built-in server if you just want to keep life simple and you have PHP installed on your machine. And so the way that we can do that is just by doing this: PHP hyphen uppercase S localhost, and then colon a port number. Choose any port number you want, and then we also need to give it the target file, the front control file. If I hit enter there, okay, and then I can go and visit that. And so here's our web page, as you can see, hello world. So that's one way of doing it. If you just want to do that, that'll be perfectly fine. What I'm going to do though is I'm actually going to use Docker. So I'll show you how we can do that as well, and I'll also provide you with a Docker compose file. And so your setup will be really easy. It'll be just a case of running a command and you'll have the exact same setup as me. Okay, so I'm just going to stop this, and then in the root of my project, so the very top level, I'm just going to create a file called docker compose. So docker-compose.yaml, and in there I'm going to paste in some very simple configuration. Now I'm not going to go through this line by line because I do actually have a Docker course on garyclarke.tech, and it's free, so you can enroll in that if you want to know more about Docker. But I'll just explain what the two entries are here. So we have two services. One of them is our web service, so this is basically an Nginx proxy server, and then we have app, and so this will be our PHP application, and they use images which I created that are perfect for this kind of simple application that we're going to work on here. The other thing that I should mention are the volume mounting. So here we're basically performing a volume mounting, so the files in our public folder that you see here will get mounted into this location on the server, and the same with app. So everything in this top level folder here will get mounted to this location on the server. Here's the command you need: docker compose up -d for run in detached mode, which means we'll get the terminal handed back to us. And what I'll say about this is you will need to have Docker Desktop installed, and you will need to have Docker Desktop running, otherwise obviously it won't work. So if you want to know how to get that installed and running, just go and check out the first couple of videos of my Docker course, and it'll show you how to get up and running with that. Okay, let's hit go on this. So what it'll do is it'll spin up the framework. It'll create the two containers, our app container and our web container. And what this means is we should now be able to go and just visit localhost. So we don't need the port on the end there now, although you could put 80 because it's using port 80. Hit enter, and again same result. So it's still sending back the same content, hello world. And the configuration which I created for our Nginx server here is configured for requests to just enter the public folder and to hit that index.php file. So it's set up perfectly for what we need. Let's go back and have a quick look at this before we move on. So we created a public folder, and in there we created an index.php file, and this is going to act as our front controller, i.e. it's a single entry point into our application where we will receive the request perform that logic and send back a response. So there are not multiple different PHP files that people can hit in a web browser. You go straight to this file. And I've actually set up my Nginx configuration so that you won't be able to go and specify which PHP file you are looking for. And that is why we get this 404 not found that you see here. And none of our other PHP files will live in this public folder. They'll all live outside of it, which means that there'll be absolutely no way that you can just try and access our other PHP files from the outside world. The next thing I want to do is create a request class and a response class so that I can have objects which represent a HTTP request and a HTTP response. But before I do that, I think it would be best to set up some auto-loading, because if we're going to be creating a load of new classes, then it's going to really help us out if we have auto-loading in place. One other thing which I should mention is that since the end of the last recording, I've just added this line to the top of the index.php file here, declare strict types equals 1. So now we'll have strict typing, and I think that will also be beneficial. If you want to know more about that kind of stuff, just check out the Object-Oriented PHP course on Gary Clarke Tech. In the root of my project, I'm going to create a file called composer.json. So here there's actually a helper in PHP Storm which will put a bit of boilerplate in there, and then I can just go and fill out the rest of this. If you're not using PHP Storm, just sort of copy what I do here. Behind the scenes, I've filled out some of the boring stuff. Let's do the auto-loading here. So add a key called autoload, and then we want PSR for auto-loading for this. So PSR-4, and then what we want to do is we want to map certain namespaces to certain folders. Now the folder structure is going to be very important in this. So because we're kind of building an application but also at the same time building a framework, I want to keep those two things separate. So anything which would form part of the framework that I'm creating, I'm going to put in a folder called framework. And then anything which is the application, because obviously in order to demonstrate this, we're going to need something to demonstrate this. So we're going to have to create some kind of application files as well. And I'll put those in an app folder. So we need to create two mappings here. The framework one, I'm going to map those to a namespace which will comprise of my name plus the word framework maybe. And then for the application, I'll just create a source folder, and then that will map to the namespace app, which is quite a common kind of convention which you'll see in things like Symfony and Laravel. Okay, so hope that's making sense. It certainly will do when I show you this now. So this is going to be our application files. So that is the app namespace, which will map to a folder called source. The two backslashes on the end of there are important, by the way. It won't work without those. PHP Storm's handily asking me if I want to create the directory source, so I might as well do that. Okay, let's go and create another namespace. So here really, if you're creating like a framework or something, you want to come up with a namespace which isn't going to clash with others. It needs to be quite unique. So there's nothing more unique than your name. And I'll then add on the word framework. Okay, so I might change that to something a bit more inspirational later, but for the time being we know that that namespace isn't going to clash with anything else. And all of these files, all my framework files which I create, will go in a folder called framework. Again, PHP Storm is asking me the same question: do I want to create a directory called framework? So we'll say yes. We'll go and check those out. We've created an empty folder called source and one called framework. And then I think what I want to do is actually I'll run the auto-loading here. So I have Docker running. If you're not using Docker and you're just going to use your local composer, then just run this command. So composer dump autoload. Okay, so I'm going to do something similar to that. It's not essential because I do have composer on my local machine, but I'm just going to get used to showing you these commands if you do have a Docker container running with PHP and Composer in. So docker compose exec app, and I'll just make this a bit smaller. And so as you can see, docker compose exec app, and then it's the same command after their composer dump autoload. So basically run this command in this container. Okay, so it's generated our autoload files. What I want to do now is pull in a package which is going to help us with a bit of development and debugging, and that is Symfony Var Dumper. It's something which I use on every single project which I ever create. So, docker compose exec app composer require Symfony /var-dumper dumper. So that will now go and install, and as you can see we have it in our docker compose file. I really wanted to pull this in as a dev dependency, so what I'm going to do is actually just change this to require dev. But what this means is that we should now have a vendor folder. As you can see, here it is, and inside of there we've now got our autoload.php, which means we can start autoloading files and they'll be autoloaded from or using these namespaces and these folder locations. So let's go to our index.php and let's add autoloading at the top. So require once, and we are looking in our root directory for the vendor folder, and inside of that vendor folder the autoload.php file. So dir name, then using the magic constant dir for the directory which we are currently in. That will get us to the root level, and then we're just saying vendor, then autoload.php. And the way that we can check that this is working is to use that package which we just pulled in, which was Symfony Var Dumper, and in there is a function called dd that stands for die and dump, and so it will kill the application, then dump out whatever variable you pass it or variables that you pass it. So we'll just say here. Then over to the browser, give it a refresh, and that's exactly what we see. So I've not done anything too exciting there, but what we have done is we've got ourselves set up so that we can now go and start creating classes, and we'll start working on the request class in the next one. In this one we're going to create a HTTP request class, and this will act as a container for all of our superglobals so that we've got all that information available to us all the way through our application. What we're going to do is we're going to create our own, but we're going to base it on the Symfony HTTP Foundation request, because say for example we want something a bit more complex than what we've created later on as our application, our framework progresses, then we can easily swap it out for that one because we'll have built it using a similar kind of interface. But if we don't need that complexity, then we'll have built something a lot smaller and a lot lighter. So what am I talking about when I say the Symfony HTTP Foundation component request class? This is it here. You can navigate to this page, and basically we're going to create this request class or something based on this, and as you can see it is constructed using all of the superglobals, so we'll have all that information available to us. And the way that this works here is they use a static factory method, create from globals, and so if we copy this kind of interface, if we have the same method, then if we do decide we want to switch out to use the Symfony one later on to have that extra functionality, then we won't need to change much of our code because we'll have built it using a very similar interface. Back in our code in the index.php file, let's go and create the objects that we wish we had, and then we can go and actually create those classes that we need based on that. So what we're saying is we want to create a request object, and the way we want to request it is by using a static factory method on a request class. So we'll just do this like so. Double colon is for calling static methods. If you're a bit unsure on some of this stuff, then just go and do my object-oriented PHP course. I cover all of this stuff in there: constructors, static methods, etc., static factory methods, all of that good stuff. The method that we want, we're going to name it exactly the same as the Symfony HTTP Foundation method, and it is create from globals. And just an interesting thing to note is that under the hood, Laravel also uses the Symfony HTTP Foundation component. And so it's good for me to show you this stuff and show you how it's working under the hood, even though we are going to create our own version of that. Okay, so far so good. Now this request class is going to be part of our framework, and so for that reason we're going to put it in our framework folder, and it's going to come under a namespace of HTTP. So inside of the framework folder, create another one called HTTP, and then inside of there we'll create our request class. And then here we'll add our namespace. So if I go back to my composer.json file just to remind myself of what namespace we used here, it's Gary Clarke framework, and then it will be HTTP. Okay, so you're probably using a different namespace, but just make sure that it matches up with what you specified in your autoloading in your composer.json file. So class request, we need a public static function called create from globals. And this will return an instance of itself. So here we can say static. And so here we just want to create an instance of itself using the PHP superglobals. So let's go and create the constructor first. And here I'm going to use constructor promoted properties because I'm using PHP 8 and above. If not, you'd have to do it old school where you go and pass in the variables and then create the properties separately up here and then assign them in this part. But I won't need to do that because I'm using PHP 8. I recommend you do the same because we're using Docker here, so my Docker setup is using PHP 8 and above. At the top here, I'm just going to temporarily paste in the superglobal so that I know what I'm creating here. And so I'm going to use public read-only properties because one of the advantages of doing this way is that we grab those superglobals, and so then we have a snapshot of the state of our application, the state of the request at the time that is received. And by actually storing these values as properties on this request class, we know that they can't change and they can't be tampered with, whereas the values in the actual superglobals, they can be changed. And so here we're making sure that we have actually preserved those values as they are when the request is received. And again, because I'm using PHP, I think 8.1 and above, I can use read-only properties, which means that they get set, but then they can't be changed afterwards. And that also means that I won't actually need to set them as private and add a load of getters and setters. So it means we're writing less code as well, which is pretty cool. So public read-only, and this will be an array. And so the first one is get, and so we shall just call this get params. And so these are your query parameters that you would see in the address bar. We'll have a look at them shortly. Next, we'll do the same thing for the post parameters. And these are the parameters, the values that you would receive from submitting a form, for example. So we have cookies. All of these are arrays, by the way. And then finally we have our server variables, and we'll go and dump those out shortly to see what kind of values that we see in there. Okay, so this means that here we can just say return new static and then just pass in these superglobals in that very order. Okay, so I can remove this comment here, that's not needed anymore. I'll just scroll down so that you can see that create from globals method. Let's go back to our index.php file. So we need to make sure that we're getting the correct request here. So this is the one that we're looking for, Gary Clarke Framework HTTP. And then let's just dump it out and see what values we have stored on this request. Over to the browser and refresh. Okay, so here are our cookies. You see the get parameters is empty at the moment, and post parameters, we'll fill those in a second. Let's have a look at our cookies. So we have the PHP session ID, that should be recognizable to you. This one is one which is set by PHP Storm. Let's have a look at our server variables. So there's quite a lot more here. The interesting ones, the ones that we're going to use maybe down the bottom here, so request URI, so we're going to use that for our path info, and we're going to be able to use that in order to find the controllers, the handlers for our requests. So I'll show you how that changes. If I went and changed this to foobar, for example, and then we went and looked at our server variables again, and so you see that our request URI is now foobar. How about if I added a query parameter. For example, if I say name equals Gary, you'll see that our get parameters now has a value in there. So we have name equals Gary in there. And then if we go and look at our server variables, you'll see that our request URI also has that query parameter appended onto it. You'll see a lot of other interesting stuff here. You can see the server name, the ports that we're using, server software, document URI, and so all sorts of useful information here that we'll be able to use and we'll be able to access from our request class or our request object inside of our application. And if you think about what we covered on things like encapsulation in my object-oriented PHP course, this is a perfect example. All of the data regarding the request, it's all held in one place. It can't be tampered by any code elsewhere in our application, and we're not having to handle a load of loose variables like you do with superglobals, which can actually be altered. So this is a perfect example of encapsulation. We created that request class in order to encapsulate the data available to us when the HTTP request is received by our application. Now what we want to do is create a sibling class, and that will be a response class, and that will be comprised of three main parts. It will be the content, the status, and also the headers, i.e. all the information which gets sent back with the HTTP response. And so let's think about how we'd like this to look. So here, instead of echoing hello world, we'll set this as our actual content, so part of our response content. And then what we want to do is create a response object. So obviously we haven't created a class yet, but let's just write out the code how we'd like to use it, and that is usually a good way to guide you. So response equals new, and we'll create a response class. And let's think about those pieces of data that we just mentioned. We spoke about content, so let's create a named argument there. This will receive the content, and then we said status. So again, we'll do the same thing there, and we'll just assume that this is going to be a 200 response, and then also we'll say headers, and here we'll just start off with an empty array and keep life simple for the time being. And then what we want to do is send back that response. So again, using the similar kind of interface as what's used by the Symfony HTTP Foundation, and the same way as what both Symfony and Laravel send back a response, we're just going to call a method on that called send, which means that we now need to go over to our framework folder, and inside the HTTP folder where we created the request class, what we'll do is we'll now create a response class to go along with that. Okay, so the first things I need to check is that the namespace is correct here, so that looks correct to me. Gary Clarke Framework HTTP, and then we know what our constructor is going to look like because we've already established that in our index.php file. So we need content, status, and headers. And I'm going to make all of these private. So private string will also allow null, I think, but we'll default it to an empty string. And then we need the status code, so the HTTP status code is what I mean by that, and we'll default this to 200. And then we want an array of headers. Again, we'll default that to an empty array. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is create that send method for actually sending back this response. So public function send, and I'm actually going to make this void because what we're going to do here is we're actually going to echo this content, and that means that that should be what gets sent to the browser or sent to the client. Back in our index.php, we just need to make sure that we are using the response which we just created. So Gary Clarke Framework HTTP. And what I'll do is I shall simplify this. So if we scroll to the top there, all I've done there is I've just created a use statement to pull that in. And I think in order to mix this up a bit, what we'll do is we'll actually make this a H1. So H1, and again we'll go with hello world. Close the H1. And then if we go to our browser and refresh, we now see a heading of hello world. So again, we've got a really nice useful object there. We've encapsulated all the data which is needed to be sent back to the client all in one place. We don't have to go looking for it from separate arrays or variables here, there and everywhere. We can just call properties on this response object. I'm just going to finish off by importing this, so in the same way as I just did with response, I've simplified the FQN there, so we are using the request and we are using the response. We've now created both ends of the request-response cycle. We have classes which represent a request and response. We're now going to focus on what actually happens in the middle, in between those two things. And what we want to do is create a class which is responsible for taking a request and turning it into a response. And the class responsible for handling this is called the HTTP kernel. The HTTP kernel is a class which is used by both Laravel and Symfony to represent the core of your application. From a very high level, its functionality, or should I say its responsibility, is really quite simple. Receive a request and output a response. And this is handled by a sole method called handle. And for the time being, that's all we're going to concern ourselves with. We're going to pass a request to the kernel's handle method and then return a response. The first thing we shall do is comment out these lines here, and then again we're just going to sketch out how we want our code to look, how we want it to work. So let's remind ourselves we want to pass a request into the handle method of a kernel class and return a response. So response equals kernel handle, and then we are simply passing in the request object into the handle method of the kernel. Obviously we don't have a kernel object yet, so let's go and create that. Kernel equals new kernel, so we're going to need to go and create that class now. And again, this is going to go in framework HTTP, and we're just going to call this kernel. So in certain frameworks you might see it referred to as different things like app kernel or maybe HTTP kernel all in one word, but we know this is the HTTP kernel by the fact that it is in that namespace and it's in the HTTP folder. So we know what this is referring to. Okay, so we've created that and we just need one method on here, and that will be handle. So public function handle, this will take a request, a HTTP request object, and it's going to return a HTTP response. So again, what we're going to do is we're just going to hard code the content for the time being. Obviously this will change later on, but all we're doing now is just making sure that we have a kernel, it's taking a request and returning a response. And so this is just a methodology which I find works for me. I tend to have something which is always or nearly always working, so I can just keep going back to the browser and I just add little bits at a time. Like we started with just a request and a response. We saw that works, and we're just adding little extra bits now, and we just build it, and we always have something which is working right from the start. And we never go too long or write too much code without actually having something working that we can check is working. Okay, so from here, let's return a new response. And the content will be the content which we just created. And as you can see, we have defaults for the status and the headers, so I don't need to actually provide arguments for that. Back to our index.php, let's make sure our kernel now belongs to the correct namespace and we are receiving the correct class there, and we can go and delete these lines now. I'll just drop that down to there, refresh the browser, that's still working, all is good. Just to finish off, I'm just going to make sure that I import this like the others. If we go to the top, then you should see 3 use statements. We're using our kernel, our request and our response. And so just to recap on where we've got so far, we started off by requiring our autoloader, which meant that we can autoload all our classes, all our vendor classes and the ones which we create ourselves in our framework and in our application. Then we created a request from the globals. Using the super globals, we're able to create that request object which holds a load of data regarding the request. Then we went and created a kernel or a HTTP kernel, which is really the core, the heart of our application, and on that we called a method called handle passing in the request. And so everything which needs to happen in between receiving that request and actually creating a response will fall within the bounds of this handle method. And then to finish everything off, we just sent back our response, which in essence we're just echoing out the content. What we want to consider now is what happens inside of this handle method. The thing that we're going to tackle next is how we can take this request and the information contained in it in order to route that request to a correct handler, which in our case will be a controller, in order to do the logic which will form that response. Now that we have our HTTP essentials in place, that's our request class, our response class and our kernel, what we want to do now is to be able to have custom handling for different requests to different URIs. And the way that we can do that is with routing. We know that when a request is received, it is forwarded always to our public index.php file, but now we need to route that to a handler, and we use the path info or parts of the URI to determine what handler it should be forwarded to. So here is an example. We have a user's URI and also a post's URI. We want to handle a request to a user's endpoint differently than we do a post endpoint, so we forward them to different handlers. What is a handler? It's nothing complex, it's actually just a function, or should I say it is a callable. So this could be either an in-place callback function, it could be the name of a function which is in the same file as the URI matching that you are currently performing, or it could be the combination of an object and the name of a method on that object. And typically you will use regular expressions or regex to match the URI to an established route and then direct the request to the handler for that route. Okay, so routing is going to be one of those rare exceptions where we just pull in a third-party package rather than trying to build our own router from scratch, simply because these things are quite complex. There's a lot of regular expression stuff and pattern matching, and I think it would sort of overtake the whole course if we started getting into a big regular expressions lesson. And so we're going to use something called FastRoute, which has a lot of downloads. It's well used, it's a very fast router, and it's also really easy to understand how it works. We'll have a quick overview of it now. So here what you do is you obtain a dispatcher, and basically you're adding a route like this. You're saying what method, for example get. So if I make a client request in the browser to a web page, that is a get request. If I was to submit a form, that would be a post request. So you tell it what type of request you're making, and then you provide a URI, but you can also provide patterns. So for example, this one here, user followed by / and then ID, is saying, okay, you then need to provide an ID, but this regex here is saying that it needs to be made up of one or more digits. And so that's the kind of pattern matching that it does. For example, if we were looking for articles, we would see something like this, articles followed by a number, and then the part in the square brackets here is optional. So you could have an article with a particular number, and then you could optionally pass a title. So if you can imagine, if we were trying to build something like this and do all the regex ourselves, it would run into well over an hour, probably a couple of hours, just to get that functionality in place. So why not use something which is already built? Because let's face it, if you look at any of the frameworks, Yi, Laravel, Symfony, they all use third-party packages which other people have built. It's a big community effort in order to produce those things. So we're just going along the same lines as what they've done there. That's a brief look at FastRoute. Obviously, we're going to look at it in more depth, but now let's start by actually pulling it in as a composer dependency. So the command that I need is docker compose and then exec app composer require, and the package name is Nikic FastRoute, like so. So fast-route. If you're not using Docker and you're just pulling it in with Composer, which you have locally installed, then obviously you just need the last part of the command, which is composer require Nikic FastRoute. Okay, then we hit go. that all looks good. Let's go over to our composer JSON, just make sure that that is there. And so I'm pulling in Nikic FastRoute and it's version 2. Okay. In the next one we'll have a look at the basics of this package. We now want to add some routes, so let me show you how we do that with FastRoute. What I'm going to do is just paste some comments in here first, and these will guide us and show us what we need to do. I've just dropped these comments underneath the existing code that we have in here. I'm going to take this code and use it in a moment, but for the time being we're going to create something called a dispatcher, and then what we do is we dispatch a URI, so we will take the URI and also the request method and pass that into the dispatcher, or dispatch that, in order to obtain the route info. And there's 3 pieces of information we want back, or 3 pieces we want back if everything has gone okay. We want a status to say that a route was found, we want the handler back, and we also want any variables. So if we pass in any variables, for example an article with an ID of 55, then we want to get back a variable ID with a value of 55. And finally what we're going to do is take the handler which is returned to us, and then we're going to call it. Okay, so let's start by creating a dispatcher, and this is how we do it with FastRoute. So it's dispatcher equals, and it's actually a function that we're going to call simple dispatcher. And if we scroll up to the top now, you should see this. So we're importing a function, FastRoute simple dispatcher. Inside of here we pass a callback, and to that callback we pass a route collector argument. And then using that route collector we can start to add routes. So route collector add route, and then the information that we need here is HTTP method, we need the route, and we need the handler. So HTTP method, we are going to say get for the actual route, it just needs to match a base URI like so, and then a handler, and here we are just going to use a callback. And then inside of here, this is where we can create our logic. So what we're going to do is just take this here, so we're saying that our content is hello world, and then we are returning from this callback function, we are returning a new response, and the content will be this. Let's actually dump this out using Symfony's dd die-dump function and see what we get. And so this is what we have. We have something called a mark-based dispatcher, and inside of that we have an array which is a static route map, and here you should see something which is familiar, and that is the route that we just defined. So we said it's going to be for get requests, we're looking at the base URI, and then it says that that is pointing towards a closure. So a closure is an anonymous function that can access variables imported from outside scope like we are doing here. So let's go ahead and actually use this dispatcher. So what we want to do, or what we want to return here, is we want to get back the route information. So we're hoping to get back 3 pieces of information if everything works correctly here. That is the status to say that the route was found. We want to also get our handler, and then we also want to get any variables that we can pass to that handler. And so what we'll call this is route info, and then we will say dispatcher, and we're just going to call dispatch. We need 2 pieces of information here. We need the HTTP method, which in our case is get, and we also need the URI, and we can get both of those pieces of information off of our request. Obviously this isn't something that we want to hard code. This is going to be something which is dynamic. It will change with each request that comes into our application. So before we do this, let's go and dump out a request, and we'll see where we can get the information that we are looking for. So again, I'm going to go back to the browser, refresh. Here's all the information on our request, and the variables that we want are on the server array. Okay, so scroll down here. This is what we're looking for, request URI, as you can see there. We also want the request method, and that is there. So we can access this off of the server variable on our request object. Let's go ahead and do that. So first, request server, and here we want the method, request method that is. Let's drop this down onto its own line. I can copy this onto another line, and then what I want here is request URI. Then again, I'm just going to go and dump out the route info. So you'll notice I dump things out quite a lot, and that's just to make sure that I am getting the right information and this is working correctly before I go and start and writing any more code. So let's refresh this. Okay, so we're getting back what we want. One, I'll show you what that means in a minute, but here's our closure, i.e. our handler. The one is this here, it's the status. So we have a dispatcher interface. If we go to that, then you'll see we have our three statuses here. 0 means not found, 1 means found, and 2 means method not allowed, which usually means that you've sent a GET request to a certain endpoint, but a GET request doesn't exist for that, but there might be other kinds of requests allowed, such as post or put for that endpoint. But we'll talk about that kind of stuff later on when we get to doing that. All we want to do now is just get this working happy path. I'm going to take my route info and I'm going to sort of unpack it into variables. So we know that the first one is the status. We're not actually going to use that. The second one is the handler, and then the third thing we should get back is the variables. As you saw, that was actually empty, but when we do another example in a moment, we'll actually use some variables. So now I have those three variables. What I want to do is call the handler method, passing in the variables, and then return whatever that returns. So return handler vars. And if I go and refresh this now, then we're back to hello world, because we are actually returning a response containing this content. So that was a nice easy example. Now let's do one using something called route parameters. And what I'd like to do for this is have this kind of URI where we can say something like posts followed by an ID for a post. And so that's the kind of route that we need to match. Let's go and give that a go. So I'm going to copy this whole route. You can have as many routes as you like, but as you can see, this could start to be quite cumbersome. Imagine we had like 50 routes in our application. Would you really want to be writing it all in a handle method on the kernel like this? That wouldn't be practical. So what we're going to do shortly is actually refactor this and store all the routes in their own file. Okay, but for this one, it is also going to be a get. We are going to get a post endpoint. And then if we look how this works in the documentation, if we want to have a variable called ID, which is for 1 digit or more, this is how it's done. And so in between these parentheses here, this is where we define our route parameters. And when we define route parameters, that means we can actually pass an argument to our callback function or whichever handler we use. So in here, instead of saying hello world, what I'm going to say is this is post, and then I'll change those to double quotes. Route params is an array, so I can access an ID key off of the route params array. So a route params and then ID. All of the rest should work exactly the same here. We don't have to change any of this. Again, we're getting the status, the handler, and the variables off of route info, and then we are calling the handler and passing in the variables. And this time we should have some variables because we created our route parameter here. And maybe it would have been more clear if I'd have just called this variables, the same as what I've used here, but basically we're referring to the same thing. This is what is getting passed into this function here. Let's go and give this a go. Okay, this is post 23, and to show that this is dynamic, let's just change it to something else. This is post 55. And just to be clear on this, we could have given this ID here, we could have given it any name, we could have called it post ID. If we'd called it something else, we just would have needed to make sure that this name, the key that we're trying to access, actually matched up what we called it. So that's a happy path version. That's what happens when a route can be found. If a route can't be found, then we actually get a different status back, and we have to handle it in a different way. So say, for example, I went to posts and I did pass a route param, but I didn't pass a digit. I passed something else. And I'll just demo that now. For example, if I went foo, then this time we're getting undefined array key and we get some errors because we don't actually have handling set up for if we pass the wrong kind of information. Like I say, all we are handling here is a route found response. But don't worry about that, that's something that we're going to get to very shortly. In this one, I want to create an accessor method for our request URI because there are instances where it might not come back the way we want it. What do I mean by that? Let's go and have a demo. If I did something like this, posts, and then I also added a get parameter or a query parameter, let's go and dump out what we would actually see there. Okay, so as you can see, we actually still get the query parameter appended onto the end of the URI. And for actually finding or matching our routes and our URIs, that is not what we want. So we want to actually create an accessor method where we remove the query parameters from the end of that. And so what would I want that to look like? What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method called getPathInfo. So request getPathInfo, like so, will now replace this. So I'll cut that from there and we'll go over to our request class and we'll go and create that at the bottom here. And this will return a string. And so how can I remove that query parameter? I can use PHP's string token function. So the first thing that I pass to this is the string, and then the second argument will be the token, and so that will be the question mark. And instead of request, it actually needs to be called off of this. So we'll go and have a look at the string token function in a second. I'll just make sure I'm returning that. Let's go and have a look at the documentation for this function. Okay, so it says it tokenizes a string. The string will be tokenized when any of the characters in the argument are found. And so in our case, that question mark will be found, and then that is where the string will actually be split, and we'll just return the URI, the part that we want. Or should I say, the path being the part that we want. Okay, back to our kernel. Let's just dump this out and make sure that it's doing what we want it to do. Request getPathInfo, back over to the browser, hit go, and so great stuff. Now we're just seeing this post. So perfect, that's doing what we need it to do. So that's a handy little method. I think what we'll do is we'll actually create one for the get method. So here where we're accessing the request method, we might as well put that in there as well. I think that will be quite a useful thing, and I'm pretty sure that Symfony uses this as well and other frameworks. So we will call this get method. We of course don't have to do this because we've created public read-onlys on our request, whereas other frameworks will probably have those variables as private, but this is okay. It just makes things look a bit more consistent, I think. Again, this will be a string, and we shall return the request method. Again, this is being called off of this, semicolon on the end, and if we go back to the browser and refresh, then everything should still be working. So we'll change this back, change it to post 23. Okay, this is post 23, so everything's working exactly the way that it was, and we have two handy new methods on our request class. Okay, so far we have defined our routes inside of the kernel class in our HTTP folder. But if you think about this is wrong for a lot of reasons. The first and most obvious reason is that this code, these endpoints, are specific to a particular application. But what we're building here inside the framework folder is actually meant to be reusable code which you share and can be installed into all different projects. So we don't want stuff which is specific to a particular application in here, so we need to have something which is dynamic, and for that reason we're going to move our routes out into a dedicated file, and that's something that they do in all frameworks. So I'm going to show you how Laravel handles this. Here I've opened a Laravel project, and in the root of the project we have a routes folder, and inside of there are different files depending on what kind of application you are building. So say for example you're doing a REST API, you can have a file dedicated to that, and if you're building just a web application, a website or something, then we can have a routes file dedicated to that. And so that's what I've got open here, and as you can see these are all different routes being registered. So there we have one for like a home page, just a base URI. We have one for posts. You get the idea. This is the kind of thing that we've been doing in ours. So what we're going to do is flip back to our framework that we're building and actually create a routes file for a web application. In the project root here I'm going to create a new folder which I'll call this routes, and then inside of there we'll just add a PHP file called web, and this will be all the endpoints for a web application. So what do I want to return from here? Let's go back to the kernel. So we're thinking about how we define our routes. If we remember, a route is made up of three pieces of important information: the request method, so in this case that is get, the URI, and that is that part there, and then the third part is the handler, which can be a callable. So we need to return three pieces of information for each route. Let's go back to our web.php file, and so we're going to return a multi-dimensional array which can contain many routes, and we're just going to stick to creating one route for the time being to keep life simple, just so that we actually understand this. So we are making a get request to base URI, and then the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to use controllers. So up to now we've just used a callback in the kernel class, but a controller is a special kind of class, and each method on the, well, not each method, but you'll have methods on that controller which are dedicated to handling particular requests. So what do I mean by that? Let's go and create this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a controller called home controller, and then on that there will be a method called index, which will be dedicated to handling get requests to this endpoint. Obviously this hasn't been created yet, but this is one way of sort of creating a callable. In reality, this would need to be an object. You can't just say pass a string and say use this class. We will need to actually instantiate the object, but this will give us a good point and something to return which we can instantiate. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the index.php file and define a base path which will make it easy to find files such as these throughout our application. This will make sense when I show you in a second. So in index.php at the very top here we shall define a constant, and I'm going to call this base path. Dir name, and then passing it the dir magic constant, and so what that will do is it will point to the parent of this directory. So this directory is public, the parent of that directory is the root of our project. So now we have a base path which is defined and which we can use throughout our application. So let's go back to the kernel class now. I'm going to comment out the routes that we've already defined and just move those down a bit, and then I will create a routes variable. This is inside of the simple dispatcher, by the way, just in case that wasn't clear. So routes equals, and we'll say base path, and then in fact we need to include this, sorry about that, include base path, and then routes, and then web.php. And then we need to loop over those routes, so for each routes as route, and then what we're going to do is add the route to the route collector. So it's the same code as what we use here. Route collector add route, except this time our route is an array with three parts. So if we go back to web.php, we're getting an array with three parts here. So what we need to do is actually unpack that route into the three parts which are required. Let's go and have a look at the add route function here. So we need HTTP method, route, and then handler. And so that is how we have defined that in our web.php. Method, URI, handler. So in order to unpack that, we can just use this operator here, followed by the name of the variable. So you might hear these three dots being referred to as a spread operator or a splat operator, but basically it does what I've just explained. It will take the array and unpack it into the parts that make up that array. We can head back to the browser and see if this has worked. If it has worked, I'm expecting to see an error to say that it can't find a home controller because we haven't actually created that yet. But it will be good news because it will mean it's got as far as that point where we're actually passing in the route to the add route on the route collector. So let's go and refresh this. Okay, so fatal error, uncaught error, class home controller not found, which is good news. Like I said, it's got us as far as we can get with this. So what we need to do now is actually go and create that home controller, and we'll do that in the next one. Okay, so we've said that for our route handler we want to use a controller class and we want to call a method on that class. So let's go and actually create that. This should be fairly straightforward to do. So this will be classed as application code. It's not part of the framework code. Whatever you're building, you go and create whatever controllers you need with the framework and the tools that you have available to you. So inside of a source folder, we're going to create a folder inside of there called controller. This is exactly the same as what they currently do in the Symfony framework. And then inside of there, we're just going to create our controller called home controller. So this will reside in a namespace if we're following PSR4, which will be app/controller. Okay, so create a PHP class, home controller. And we need to make sure we get the namespace right. So we said that for all of our folders and files which go inside of source, then the base namespace will be app, and then following the PSR4 convention, you then name the following branches of your namespace after the folders which follow. So app controller, and then back to our web.php, and then we need to make sure that we're pulling in the correct home controller with the correct namespaces. So app controller, home controller, that should be good enough. Next, let's go back to our kernel class, and at the bottom we need to decide how we're going to handle this. So first, let's see what route info looks like now that we've actually added that handler in that format. So dd route info, back over to the browser and give this a refresh. And so here we have an array with three parts. Number one is the status, so we have looked at that, and one means found. Then number two, this is your handler. So our handler is a combination of this controller, app controller, home controller, and a method on that controller. And number two is any vars, basically any get parameters, but we haven't used any of those, so we're not actually passing any of those into our controller. But we know here the format, so we know how we can go and handle this. So really we just need to make a minor tweak. Where we've got handler, we know that that's going to be an array comprised of the controller and the method on that. So let's unpack that this way. So we'll say controller and then comma and then method. And then to get our response, remember that at the moment that controller is just a string with the namespace, so we need to actually instantiate that. So to get a response, we can say response equals, and then we'll say new controller, and then off of that we're going to call the method, and into that we're going to pass the vars, the variables. So we don't actually have any, it's empty, but that's okay. And so now all we need to do is just return that response. If we were to return it as it is right now, we won't actually see anything, because if you remember when we created the body, in fact we haven't even created the method yet. So we need to create that index method. Let's go ahead and quickly do that. And again, we're going to return hello world, just like we always have done. So content equals, and we'll create a H1 again. And then we are returning a new response. And so the response for my namespace, I've got it set up as this, just a quick reminder, Clarke Framework HTTP response. You no doubt will have it set up differently, maybe using your own name, but just make sure you've got the right namespace there. And inside of this, for the first argument, we're just going to pass the content. Okay, so hopefully if this has worked, we should be able to go back to the browser and see hello world. Let's give this a go. Okay, perfect. So I would class that as a fairly significant breakthrough. We now have pretty much the same kind of mechanism for routing to a controller as what is used in the main frameworks like Laravel and Symfony. We're simply creating a route in our webs file. We're saying what we'd like you to do is when you receive a GET request to this is to route it to the index method on the home controller, and then all of the functionality in the creating of the response is handled by that class and by that method. We're sending that back and then we're letting the kernel do the rest. So I've had to do a little bit of customization here on what we already had, but it's still doing functionally the same thing. We're just making sure that we have it set up so it can actually call that method on that controller and return the response. Here you can see a squiggly line underneath the response because it's offering to inline that for me, but I want to keep this fairly explicit so you know that here we are actually creating a response rather than just saying return this. I want it to be known that that is actually a response which is coming back from that method, and so that is why I'm keeping that variable in place like so and then returning it separately on the second line or the next line. And this comment has now become a bit redundant. Let's actually see if we can let it make more sense. That's better. The one and only route that we currently have defined so far is fairly straightforward, and we're not actually passing any arguments to our index method on the home controller which that route is set up for. So let's now make this a little bit more complex. So if we go back and look at our kernel, I've actually deliberately kept the route that we're now going to create in the comments here. So this is what we're going to try and create now. We want to go to a posts endpoint, but we also want to have this variable route parameter here, which will be an ID. So let's first go to our routes file and create that. Or the file is called web.php, so we'll copy that to there, and then here we want to just change this. So we are going to make a GET request to a post endpoint, which will be followed by a 1 digit or more. So we're giving it a name which will be ID, and then we have a colon, and then the part that falls after that is the actual regex pattern. Our controller for this will be a posts controller, and we'll create a method on there called show. So obviously that post controller doesn't exist yet, so inside of source, inside of the controller folder, let's create a new controller called posts controller. Okay, and then on that we want to create a method called show. Because of the way that FastRoute works, which is what we're using, we will automatically get past that ID. From here we're going to return a response. So let's go ahead and create some content. We'll put it in double quotes so that we can actually use a variable inside of there. We'll say this is post followed by the ID. So for example, if the post is 55, it'll say this is post 55. And then we need to return a new response. And we pass into that the content. Let's just go back to our web file and make sure that we don't have any errors here. So app controller, post controller, that all looks good. How about if we went and tried this out in the browser? Let's go and give this a refresh. In fact, it's not refresh, we need to actually change this route now. So we're saying post, and let's go for post 23. Okay, so here we have a type error, and I was actually expecting this because of the way that we currently have this set up. App controller post controller show argument 1 must be of type int array given, and the clue to how we solve this is back in our kernel. So let's go to our kernel. So here the vars is actually an array, but we're calling the method, which would be the show method, we are passing an array, but we have actually type hinted an ID. So I don't really want to change the way that we're type hinting our controller methods. I want these to be quite explicit about what arguments should be passed into them. So we need a different way of actually handling this, of actually calling that method. And we can actually use PHP's built-in call user func array function, which would make a lot more sense for this, and it'll be more flexible. Let me show you how this works. So response equals, and the function we want is call user func array. If we go and look at the actual signature for this, so it takes 2 arguments. The first one is a callable, so you can use a callback for that, and we can stick to the same kind of methodology as what we've currently been using, which will be an object and then the string representation of a method on that object, and then you pass an array of arguments. And so we already have an array of arguments, so this should suit the bill, and what will happen is PHP will just grab those and pass in what is needed by our function, which is our show method on the post control class. So for the first part here, we're going to say new controller again, and then the second part of that is the method, which we are getting a method which should be the string show, and then for the second argument we're just going to pass the vars like we were doing before. And by doing it this way, that number of variables could be different in all scenarios, but we just know that in each one the correct number of arguments is going to be passed to our method. And so I can actually delete that now, just rearrange things a little bit, and then we can go back to the browser and see if this is actually working. Refresh. Okay, this is post 23. Just to be thorough, let's make sure that this is working for all routes, because we've just checked it on our new route there. How about if we want to just go to localhost? Okay, perfect. So it's working for everything now. Whether we have route parameters or whether we don't have route parameters, this will still work. It's a nice flexible system. I hope you're enjoying the course so far. This YouTube preview is the first 2 sections of the full course, which can be found at garyclarke.tech. There's a lot more ground to cover, so let's keep the momentum going. You can enroll in the full course and take advantage of getting all the code examples and all that great stuff by clicking the link on the screen or in the description below this video. I'll see you on the inside.